melodies live on. Barstools and Bandtalk with Dave and Sean.
Something happened. I turned into Dave. That's the other fellow.
Sean.
We are Barstools and Bandtalk. The special interview tonight. Every interview that we do is kind of special, to be perfectly honest. But I guess we give this one to our good friend Jamie Roberts, who was focused up with a number of bands that a lot of our normal audience wouldn't have seen before. And these fellows out of New York. Why don't you bring them on, Sean?
Yeah, and I mean, kudos to Jamie. She has so many different acts that she represents, and you know, Tim Ripper-Owens was part of that. We're looking to talk to KK Downing at some point. You know, yeah, Temp was one of her acts. I mean, Jamie's really she's really been a great supporter of this show, and so she introduced us to Peter Wilson, and he's with a band called Four Trips Ahead, and Nick, his PR guy who works with Jamie, sent me some of their tunes, and I was just instantly impressed. So without further ado, we're going to have the wonderful Peter Wilson, all the way from Queens, New York.
There he is. Bring him right on.
Welcome, sir.
Hello, gents. How are you?
Good. You know what? You kind of remind me of Fred Coury from Cinderella. You get that Fred Coury kind of look there, man. I don't know.
Fred Coury haircut. That's
Yeah,
exactly
well,
what I was going for. The long,
you know what?
I hope it's the long, cold winter look as opposed to the night songs look. Because right?
Yeah, absolutely. And he didn't play on either album, which that wasn't. But anyway,
he got to play an arcade, though. I think, right?
Yeah, he did. Segue into when we were talking just before we get started. I said, Nick, your PR man sent me your tunes, and I listened to them, and I'm sitting there trying to peg your influences. Some of the freshest stuff I've heard in a while. Why don't you let the cat out of the bag, if you will? Who did you grow up listening to? Because I can't put my finger on it.
Wow, that's really, you know, we're in New York City, so one of the things that's a blessing and a curse when we're asked this question is that it makes my mind go in a million different directions, because we grew up literally listening to a lot of different music. I don't think you can be a really good musician, period, not listening to a lot of good music. And in New York, there's so many, you know, great types of music and musicians, and there's a lot of cross-pollination, right? You have groups that kind of have this mixture going on from the beginning. So, and in New York also, there's a lot of innovative sounds. So whether you're talking about like way back in the day and listening to stuff like, you know, listening to like Kiss, or listening to the Ramones or Anthrax or things like that, all those guys and all those groups are kind of very radical because they kind of create a sound. So, I mean, like in this band, you know, I listen to stuff like those groups, but I also listen to like King's X and and the whole band loves King's X. And, you know, my guitar player really liked, he's from Long Island more, even though he went to school in Manhattan. And so he grew up like, he really likes Dream Theater and stuff like
that's
that.
what I said, Dream Theater.
So yeah. So it's a little bit, it's like you have that going on, you know, and then we all like other groups like Pantera or Meshuggah. Even though we don't sound anything like them, some of the off-time feel that we go for, or the more aggressive stuff, there's a little hint of some of that stuff. But then, you know, I'm a huge Thin Lizzy fan. I'm also, you know, a huge old Aerosmith fan. You know, I love Bowie. We all do in the band. So there's so many different directions. And then there's lots of different music we listen to. My guitar player studied jazz, you know, so like, you know, my bass player studied jazz and so forth. My drummer is also really studied and listens to Latin music and jazz stuff and rock and extreme metal. So it's really, really all over the place. So yeah, thanks so much when you say that. I appreciate that, because that means that we're doing it right, you know?
It's a great answer, Peter, because the fact that you couldn't nail down 2 or 3 different people means that you're not a copycat. You're doing something original based on the thousands and thousands of different artists that you listen to growing up, especially in a hotspot like New York. You would have opportunity not just to hear that music, but to see it live. Which is really
cool. And by the way, you know, in New York, the live thing is very like, we grew up like, you got to be able to do it. live. You got to be able to come. It's got to be, and you have to kind of have a full package going on. You have to be able to have really good songs. You have to have a really good performance. New York audiences are a great audience to get your stuff together through, because if you can really play in New York, and because New York audiences, they kind of sit around, they're like, let me see what they're about.
Yeah.
Even if you're really killing it, they're not impressed because they've seen everything. So you got to kind of go out there and really stake your claim and do something a little different and be sincere. So you learn a lot, and then you also kind of pick up the attitude like, listen, I do this because I love it, and we're doing something different. And if you dig it, great. If you don't, you know, you can take a walk or whatever. But so yeah.
It's almost like you're channeling my thoughts here, because and I have sort of a two-parter. The first one was, so back to your influences, because even your vocal style, and you mentioned Thin Lizzy, you mentioned King's X. I mean, I love all those guys. I couldn't peg your vocal style, quite unique. But then you mentioned the New York audiences. I had the opportunity to, I didn't play in New York City, but I played in Buffalo, and I played in Toronto, and I mean, and all over Ontario and whatever. And the guy that sweeps the floors has his arms crossed, telling you suck, right?
Yeah,
so I guess the two-parter is, your vocal influences, maybe dive into those a little bit again, but then talk more about the scene, because it's really survival of the fittest, I'm guessing. And, you go up there and you kind of like, hey, if you don't like me, whatever, but just talk about that scene for a little bit.
Yeah, so I'll talk about the scene first and kind of go backwards in your question. So like, in New York, when we were starting together, we couldn't have picked a worse time to kind of get together doing the kind of music we were doing, because, we got together really like 15 years ago, kind of really starting to get serious about stuff. And the music, besides, I'm not even talking about the industry end of it, but just the scene in New York was really weird. It was very like, you had really like kind of garagey music that was kind of playing. A lot of groups wanted to sound like the Strokes and things like that, kind of collegey, garagey, kind of third wave of like that kind of music and that scene. And then you had like a lot of really postmodern kind of punk stuff that wasn't really punk, that was kind of pop. You had a lot of singer-songwriter stuff. So, what was happening is like metal and hard rock was running to the recesses of the outer boroughs. So you start to get more of a extreme metal scene in Brooklyn. And Queens and Brooklyn have always had, even the Bronx has always had these like enclaves of metal and ultra hard rock, but it was really extreme. And I like a lot of that, but my vocal style, like I'm more of a singer. I probably go as far as about Meshuggah, but when it starts becoming like where I can't really make out the vocal kind of thing, it's not really quite my thing. Musicianship is great, but we kind of come from a different place. So we had that going on, and it was really weird. And so in the city, we were kind of on our own. And it was really tough initially, even though we both come from bands that a bit of a following. Bookers were kind of a little tepid in the beginning because we didn't fit any of that kind of cute college rock kind of thing going on. And we certainly weren't playing in Long Island, where Long Island, the scene, anyone in New York will tell you, Long Island, the scene is like covers and tribute bands. And no disrespect, I have friends that are great musicians that play in those bands and tribute bands and things like that. But my heart, when I want to do music, I'm not good at covering people's songs. I'm really good. I listen to them. I love them. I can dissect it, but I'm not good at like really doing covers for the most part, here and there. But I've never done that kind of full time. So we were kind of this interesting, like kind of mixture of bands trying to play. And thankfully we were able to hook up with some bookers that did really see and recognize what we were doing. The beginning years were kind of weird because like we kind of had a little bit of following, but it took some time. And we just kept playing and developing, and really there was like a love for what we did and a passion. And so we just kept playing and kept showing up, because I firmly believe if you're really good at what you do and you have something to say and you have songs, I think that you just have to keep showing up and keep following, the opportunities. You guys know, because you're players. So you just have to keep showing up. And that's what we really did, and essentially start to build a following, and just great things started to happen, and we started to play and get better gigs and start playing really serious venues in New York. And, things just started to kind of escalate. Obviously everything is kind of weird now, because we haven't played in some time. due to the pandemic, but there's still like, you know, a lot of buzz going on. There's still people asking when we're playing, and we're trying to figure that out. So that was something we built towards. In terms of my vocal influences, I mean, that's even crazier than probably just the music stuff. If I focus just on rock influences, which, you know, to be fair for your audience and like what we do, I love a lot of, I mean, I'm going to kind of go sort of rock and sort of not rock, but like I mean, I grew up kind of listening to Kiss records. So I love the harmonies, the Paul and Gene, kind of the metal Beatles, kind of pop metal Beatles thing I loved. But I'm a huge, I was a voice that like hit me right away, and I'm a huge Queen fan. So I loved even though I don't sing anything like or sound anything like those guys, I loved just the way they used harmony, and that you could have this ultra heavy sound, like, you know, musically, like something like Sweet Lady or Dead on Time or something, but then these like sweeping, gorgeous vocals over it. I just loved, or Ogre Battle or something. So I loved all that. And then I became kind of was, I guess it's Mark III. I always mix up. I think it's Mark III of Deep Purple.
Right.
And so I loved, even though I liked early Deep Purple, I got burned when I was like 10 years old. And I didn't, you know, I had associated Deep Purple with, you know, like the in rock stuff and the Fireball stuff.
Right.
And so as growing up, and all of a sudden hearing Glenn Hughes and David Coverdale and their voices, I like freaked out about that. So I really, and Glenn Hughes remains like, as does David Coverdale, but really Glenn Hughes is like such an inspiration. I just love everything about it. He's tremendous.
Sean
so
and
I
are
love
both big fans of Glenn Hughes. Sean and I both are. We marvel at it every day.
He's terrific. So he's a big one. But I would say that if I was being 100% like ultra honest, and someone that, and I mentioned the group already, when I was kind of coming up, a lot of the singers in hard rock and metal, everyone was trying to have the higher voice. Who can hit the, you know, it got to the point of absurdity with like Steelheart and stuff like that. But it was always kind of like the higher your voice could go, the better you were, or the more healing vocals. It was kind of like the bastardized Robert Plant kind of thing going on. And quite honestly, I couldn't identify, like I loved the music, but I was like, man, I don't sound like that, or I really want to sing, but I don't sound like that, or, you know, what am I going to do? And the rock bands that were really popular at the time, everyone had this kind of higher voice. So the two bands that like made me think I can do this, I got to see when I was a kid. I snuck into CBGB's, and before I was playing there, and a friend of mine took me to go see the Bad Brains. So I saw HR and the Bad Brains in their glory when I was like 16, and everything changed that night. I was kind of like, all right, this is like, and they were much heavier and aggressive, but it was like they didn't care. And they didn't sound like anyone else. They still don't sound like anybody else. And then I was introduced to that whole scene, and I heard all these great singers like HR, and, you know, all these great singers that didn't have that kind of voice. And then about a year and a half later, I went to go see the Stormtroopers of Death. We're doing like a one-off show, and it was like a Megaforce party. And I got to go see they were introducing all these Megaforce bands that were brand new. And there were maybe 150 people in this place because the main bands weren't on yet. And on comes this 3-piece band, and it was King's X, you know, from Houston. And I see this left-handed bass player with a mohawk, and he just opens up his mouth. And I was like, and when I heard Doug Pinnick, I was like, it was not even almost, it was a religious experience.
Yep.
So I've had that many times where I was moved. I was moved to my core. Like 3 songs in, I was like, and my friend who was sitting next to me was like, I don't even know what to say about it. I don't even know what this is. But I'm like, I couldn't emote more. And so I really related to his singing, their harmonies, and the fact, and most importantly, besides like the lyrical stuff and the feel, was just that you didn't have to follow that blueprint. You know, and what was cool is after that, I started to join bands and play, and that's when it was a great time, because then you had like the King's X's, the Living Colors, 24/7 Spies, you had like Faith No More, Jane's Addiction, and you had, you know, Voivod went prog, which I love those records. I know a lot of people don't. I love those records when Snake kind of went that way. And it was just cool because all of a sudden, and then of course the grunge scene comes and changes everything. But it was cool for me because I really liked that in between time, because I felt that people were trying to get away, do anything but necessarily sing like I have to sing with this high voice. It's a little ridiculous, and kind of do this stuff that wasn't real. Because I think a lot of the early 80s stuff, you know, like I'm a huge rap fan. I always fight with my friends. I have a friend that's a huge Crew fan, and I always say I'll give Crew the image, but Rat wins by songs every day. But I liked them because I always thought that they were kind of trying to do something a little different.
That's right.
You know, they were a little more original. And then what ended up happening is, as what happens with all scenes, like it happened with Seattle and stuff, is that all these bands are just copying that scene. But vocally, that time period was great for me, because that's when I started to take lessons and get really serious. And I was hearing all these different singers, and I would come into my first few teachers and say, how does this person do this? Or what are they doing here? Or, you know, and he would say, well, in your voice, this is how you would do it. But, you know, and then I kind of got the message that that's how you should do it.
That's awesome. Let's do this. We're going to take our first break. And I want to hear a little bit more about the lyrics and who's doing the writing in the band. And I kind of want to touch on some of that. Sean and I have experienced this before, talking to some groups out of the East Coast. There's a different flavor, almost like, I wouldn't say anger, but it's a different feel that you get from the West Coast bands. You know what I mean? And I like to get your take on that too. So we'll take a quick break, and we'll be right back after this message. So now we're on break.
Barstools